All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. Not that one, but this one. So check it out, you guys. This is going to be one of a few short stories that I got lined up for you guys. I'm still working on the other stories that I told you guys about in my last drop. However, I'm still waiting for my sources to finish giving me the details of those stories, which should be coming sometime after the holidays. Speaking of the holidays, it's now Christmas Eve, so I want to send a special shout out to all the positive people out there. I hope you guys all enjoy your New Year's. I hope it's a happy, healthy, productive, and prosperous New Year's. Again, to all the positive people out there, I salute you. To all the negative people out there, I'm not even gonna say it. So anyways, this story that I'm about to get into, it's an interesting story, and I thought you guys might like it for two reasons. For one, it talks about the details and the demise of a former high-ranked NF member, Frank Mendoza, Joker from Redondo Beach, who is a notable part of NF history. And it also talks about an individual who basically threw his whole life away after being struck out by California's infamous 3 strikes you're outlawed. So that's the gist of it. Like I said, I got a few other stories lined up for you guys, so the faster I get this one out to you guys, I can move on to the next one. Anyways, just so you guys know, as is the case with some of my other stories, some of the names of the people involved in this story might have been changed or completely omitted, just for the purpose of protecting the identities of those who choose not to be identified or involved. So this story starts out in 1986 when 18-year-old Anthony Delgado, who I'm now going to refer to as Toro, was sentenced to 4 years in state prison for receiving stolen property. You know, like a lot of us who end up going down the wrong path at a very young age, Toro started getting in trouble when he was in his early teens, and his criminal career just continued to escalate from that point on. It started out with petty crimes like shoplifting, and he started stealing anything he could get his hands on. And he just continued to go down that path until he eventually started racking up convictions for burglaries, robberies, and assaults. You know, at one point, he ended up in Solano State Prison, where he ended up picking up another conviction for possession of an inmate manufactured weapon. And because of that, he was sentenced to 3 more years in state prison. And then later, he caught a case in Monterey County and was sentenced to another 3 years for receiving stolen property. You know, I don't know if some of these cases were ran bull-legged, meaning that he was convicted separately and each one was a different term, but I'm thinking so because the bulk of them happened between 1986 and 1998. At any rate, Toro's last run was a conviction out of Santa Cruz County where he picked up a 4-year term for an assault with a firearm, and then in 1998 he picked up his 3rd strike out of Lassen County for resisting or deterring an officer with threat or violence and battery by a non-prisoner, which turned out to be an offense he caught while he was in prison. Apparently, he caught this last case while he was in Susanville State Prison, and like I said, they ended up striking him out and sentenced him to life in prison. You know, I can definitely relate to some of Toro's struggles, especially based on the fact that he'd been sitting on his 2nd strike since the early 90s. You know, as most of you who are familiar with the 3 strikes law know, that law has been tamed down quite a bit from what it originally was when it was first drafted and put into effect by Mike Reynolds in 1994. And then again, as most of you probably also know, this law was spurred by the high-profile cases of Mike Walker and Richard Allen Davis for the heinous crimes they committed against Kimber Reynolds and Polly Klaas. You know, by 1997, I had also caught my 2nd strike, and I had been walking on eggshells for years, but it still didn't stop me from going down my own path within the criminal element. However, it made me become a lot more smarter about the types of crimes I was committing out there, and it definitely slowed me down. I remember when this law was first introduced to the legislature, it was being pitched as only being intended for a small class of criminals who were committing crimes of moral turpitude or other crimes that were being committed by weirdos and sexual deviants. But by 1998-1999, after several amendments and modifications to the law, it was completely taken out of context and it was being applied to the common criminal who was considered to be habitual offenders or repeat offenders. Even Mike Reynolds, the father of victim Kimber Reynolds, who drafted the bill, was outspoken about the fact that the law was being taken way out of context and wasn't intended for the people it was being applied to. You know, I remember hearing about guys getting struck out for stealing a slice of pizza, for stealing a car, or for petty theft with the prior, or guys with non-violent crimes getting struck out in the late 90s, and it was ridiculous. You know, on the other side of it, I had ran into a lot of guys behind the walls that had been struck out over some real petty cases, and they were bitter. You know, a lot of them felt like they had been victimized by the justice system, and they were looking for any opportunity to give their life sentences some validity. What I mean by that is this: some of these guys who had been struck out and who had been given a life sentence for some of the crimes that they had committed felt like they needed to do something to legitimize their life sentence. Whether it was assaulting a CO, catching a body, or just going on one, not caring about the consequences or the extra time that they were catching. You know, in the early to mid 90s, the justice system was a different animal back in those years. If you caught an L, in your mind, that's exactly what it was. It was a life sentence. You weren't getting out because they weren't paroling anyone back in those days. And California had taken up a serious and hard stance against crime and punishment. The general consensus back then was to lock people up and throw away the key. And if you remember, they were coming out with get tough on crime bills one after the other, back to back. That's why a lot of guys who got struck out for some bullshit went on to dig themselves some deeper holes. Does that sound familiar? And stopped caring about ever getting back out of prison. That hope died when they got convicted. Because like I said, when you got an L back in those days, that's exactly what it meant, an L. You were gonna do life in prison. You know, I want to say they didn't start really thinking about modifying the 3 strikes law until sometime around 2004 when it went up on the ballot and lost. Later on, they made a second run at trying to modify it, and that's when it got some traction. Then years later, they finally started releasing lifers. And then California finally realized that its get tough on crime approach was only hurting taxpayers and congesting the prisons. So when Toro got struck out, he was one of those guys that became real bitter and swore to himself that he was going to commit more crimes to even the score and give his life sentence some validity. You know, I'm not sure what prison Toro was initially sent to when he first went to prison. I think it was Solano, but eventually he was sent to Corcoran to do a shoot term, and this is when he expressed his compatibility to share a cell with Frank Mendoza, Joker from Redondo Beach. So here's where the story takes an ominous twist. I'm sure the circumstances of Toro's life sentence continue to weigh in on him, and I'm sure he probably dwelled on it all the time. But I personally don't think that he specifically targeted Joker and had plans to take him out from the onset. You know, like I said, I ran into a lot of guys like Toro in prison who were looking for any reason to take flight and catch a body. They had already accepted the fact that they were doing life, but it was the circumstances behind their convictions that they were still struggling with. You know, from all accounts and from everything I've seen and heard about Joker, people have said that he was an aggressive type of individual and that he had a tendency to throw his weight around. That was just Joker. He was a strong character, and this was something that bled through in his actions. You know, so the one thing that I will say about Corcoran is that when it comes to compatibility and it comes to the way that Corcoran is designed, it's definitely one of the toughest prisons when it comes to finding someone you're compatible with and someone who you get along with. I hated everything about Corcoran when I did time there. The program, the COs that worked there, the weather, even the way it was designed. So the cells are set up different from other prisons. And although you might not think it makes a big difference, it really does. Because in most prisons, a 2-man cell has a bunk bed in them. You have an upper bunk and a lower bunk. And this affords you with some measure of privacy. Because at times when you just want to zone out, lay back, and get away in your thoughts, whether you're on the top bunk or the lower bunk, you're able to lay back and do it. But when you got bunks that are symmetrical or side by side, you're always looking at your cellie, and it's nearly impossible to ever get any measure of privacy. You know, when you're locked in a cell with someone 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, it makes a big difference. It takes a lot of self-discipline and mental strength to be able to get through it and get along with someone like that. You know, I literally grew up in those cells from the time I was 19 until I was in my 30s. And I had to learn how to adapt and get along with different characters. You know, all I can say is those that have been through it and those that have done that kind of time, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, so like I said, I never had an opportunity to meet Joker from Redondo Beach, as he was older than me and he was from a generation right before mine. He was around during the 70s and 80s, but he was one of the more spoken about NF members from his time. And he was obviously someone who commanded a lot of respect. You know, hailing from Redondo Beach, he was one of many NF members from Southern California that was also a part of leadership at that time. And from all accounts, he was someone that put in a lot of work. But here's a familiar theme that needs to be said. Eventually he aged, and at some point he was no longer the young lion that a lot of us heard about in some of the prison lore that he was a part of. Age took its toll, and over the course of time, there's another familiar theme for you. The once dedicated, loyal leader fell out of good graces and became a target. I'm not going to go into all the things that led to him falling into bad standings. If you guys are interested in that part of it, go back on my channel, scroll back, and look for the profile that I did on him, where I delve off into all those details and all the things that led to him defecting. So what I will say is that at one point, Joker ended up in Corcoran's shoe and eventually sailed up with Toro. I know it's probably different now than it was when I was there, but it was pretty easy to get a celly when you were in Corcoran. In Pelican Bay, it's a whole process. You got to put a marriage slip in, then they review your C file, they review his C file. It goes through a whole process and could take a long time. And then eventually, once they get a green light, they'll sell you up. But in Corcoran, it was different. It was easy. So these two end up selling up, and eventually they start bumping heads and everything goes bad. If I had to guess, I'd say Joker probably started pushing his weight around in the cell, and at some point, Toro got to the point where he had enough and he snapped. A lot of guys like Joker that have been in leadership positions, they have a hard time of letting go of that persona, that guy that they used to be, that guy who used to be in a position of authority, and they continue to try pushing that hard line. But like they say, lions don't die of old age. They die in the jaws of other lions. Anyways, according to the reports that were taken at the time of the incident, this is what allegedly happened. On September 30th, 1998, in Corcoran State Prison, sometime around midnight, one of the officers by the name of Carmona performed what is called a routine inmate count. This is where an officer walks from cell to cell, performing a head count of all the inmates in his unit. He basically walks from door to door and gets a visual on each inmate so that he can count them, as well as to also do a welfare check to make sure that all the inmates are physically up and in their assigned cells. So about 25 minutes later, after Officer Carmona performs his count, he hears Toro call out "man down," which is an indicator that an inmate is either in distress or is having some kind of medical issue. So when Officer Carmona makes his way in front of Toro and Joker's cell, he sees Toro standing by the door, and Joker's down on the floor, slumped over, on his knees between the two bunks facing the back of the cell. And because of the position that Joker was in, you couldn't see his face or his head. All you could see was the back of him. So before Officer Carmona could say anything, Toro walks over to Joker, grabs a hold of a ligature that was wrapped around Joker's neck, and calmly lifts him up by a tethered cloth that was wrapped around his neck. Then he drops him back to the ground. Joker had obviously been strangled to death. There was a pillowcase that covered his face, and that was secured by a torn strip of bed sheet. There was also a white sock and a second bed sheet that was torn and wrapped around his mouth. And then written on the back of Joker's t-shirt were the words, "There's consequences to everything. He paid his, and I'm to pay mine. Toro." So later, after both of them are taken out of the cell, Toro provided a full recorded statement about the facts and everything that led up to Joker's demise. According to Toro, he said Joker was verbally abusive and that all he did was continue to brag and boast about his status as a lieutenant in the Nuestra Familia. And then Toro also claimed that in the midst of their heated discussions, that at one point, he also warned Joker that if he continued to disrespect him, that he'd take him out. But apparently, this didn't stop Joker. He continued to disrespect Toro and he continued to antagonize him in the cell. So Toro said that at some point when he threatened Joker, that he knew exactly when he was going to take him out. He already had it in his mind. He said, "I had it in my mind that I was going to do it immediately after the officer did their late midnight walk." So that night, after Officer Carmona walked by their door, Toro said he got up, he covered the light, and then he wedged pieces of paper in the door. That was to jam the door to prevent entry. After Toro did that, he said he noticed that Joker seemed like he was nervous. So, in an effort to rock him to sleep and make him feel at ease, he sat back and he watched TV for about another 20 minutes. So at some point when the opportunity arose, Toro said he jumped up and he started choking Joker. And he said he did it for 4 minutes, which he claimed he timed. And according to Toro's statement, he said that Joker struggled, but that eventually he felt the life come out of him. Toro said when Joker stopped moving, he tied a sheet and a sock around his neck. After he tied the sheet and the sock in a knot, he said he watched him for about 10 minutes until he was sure he was gone. He said Joker had it coming, and then he struck up the message that Joker had written on the back of his t-shirt, and then he watched TV for about 10 more minutes. At that point, he said this is when he removed the paper that he had wedged in the crack of the door, and he called man down. So after this incident with Joker, Toro was charged with his homicide, and then he stayed right there in the shoe in Corcoran for about another year. And obviously, because Toro was considered to be a heightened threat towards other inmates, the classification committee opted to place him on single cell status, and his yard assignment was modified to walk alone. So about 8 months after the incident with Joker, for whatever reason, classification decided to take Toro off a single cell status, and they changed his yard assignment back to normal program. So on July 2nd, 1999, not long after classification took Toro off a single cell status, Toro was let out to one of the shoe exercise yards with another inmate by the name of Kevin Mahoney. This is when they were still running inmates out to the pie-shaped yards where the gladiator fights took place. Not the walk-alones. These were also being used at that time, but they were still using the pie-shaped yards. But they still used the big group yards to either run someone out by themselves or two people out together who they assumed were compatible. So there's a gun tower in the front of the yard that also serves as the control booth. But to be honest, the gunners, they really don't watch the yards like they used to, especially when there's only one or two people out there. Anyways, prior to this incident, Toro and Mahoney, they knew each other because they lived on the same tier with each other. But as far as anyone knew, they didn't have any issues with each other. And that's obviously why they were put out there together, because they thought they were compatible. So again, when these two were placed on the yard together, their entire interaction was recorded, as the group yards were still affixed with security cameras. So due to the fact that the gunner wasn't watching the yard that day, everything that they gathered from this point on was taken off of the video from one of the security cameras. So when they watched the footage, they said that Toro and Mahoney, when they first walk out to the yard together, they customarily shook each other's hands, and then both of them moved to separate ends of the yard. At that point, when the CO in the tower sees that nothing's happening, he probably went, sat down, picked up a DVD player, and started watching a movie. So 12 minutes into the video, these two start walking laps together, and they seem to be engaged in congenial conversation. So 52 minutes after they enter the yard, Toro launches an unannounced attack on Mahoney without warning. And this was clearly without provocation. Toro was on a mission. It didn't matter if it was Mahoney or someone else. He had a purpose. So in the camera footage, you can see Toro kicking and punching Mahoney for about 30 seconds. So after Mahoney's knocked unconscious, you can see him sitting on the ground with his back against the wall for most of the video. So after Toro attacked Mahoney the first time, he walked back to the other end of the yard, and then he starts pacing real fast, almost as if he was contemplating something. 12 minutes later, Toro takes off one of his chanclas and uses the heel to hit Mahoney in the head. The chanclas they give you in Corcoran, they're rubber, but the heel is kind of hard. They're hard enough to put a ooh-wee knot on somebody's head. So after Toro hit this guy in the head about 15 times, he walks away again. Meanwhile, Mahoney, he's still sitting in the same seated position, and he makes no attempt to move or to protect himself. Keep in mind that at no point during this attack did the officer that was in the gun tower come anywhere near the window or make any attempt to stop the assault. Honestly, when I was there in Corcoran and they used to run out the other side of the building to the yards, I used to watch the gun tower, and I never used to see them going over and looking out to the group yard. I never seen them go by that window. They would always stay seated, reading, watching a DVD player, or doing their own thing, but they never used to look out there. They might take a quick peek out there in the beginning if there was two people out there just to make sure that they were getting along, but they would never double back and go check on them again after that. And those are facts. So 27 minutes after the second attack, Toro goes back over to Mahoney. He grabs him by the back of his shirt, and then he drags him to one of the far corners of the yard. I remember going out to those yards, and there was always a corner that had shade that was dark, and that's the corner where he apparently dragged Mahoney. So at some point during the footage, Toro can be seen bending over, picking up a t-shirt. He then uses strips of the t-shirt to wrap around Mahoney's neck, the same way he did with Joker. You can't really see what Toro's doing because there's a ledge that obscures Mahoney. But you can see Toro's moving around, and at one point he's pulling. You can see him making pulling motions, and then he stays still. It was during this time that he was obviously strangling Mahoney and taking his life. And again, he claimed that he counted for 4 minutes, obviously thinking that this was the time needed to successfully strangle someone. My guess is that he probably read this somewhere and that was something that stuck with him. So after Toro walks away and he starts pacing, every couple of minutes after that, he returns over to where Mahoney's laying on the ground and he continues to stomp him out. So when correctional staff finally realized that Mahoney was down somewhere in the far corner of the yard, they made Toro prone out, but it took responding officers close to 20 minutes before they got there and were able to clear the yard. That was their first debacle. Their second debacle was taking Mahoney to an outside hospital in the back of a pickup truck because the prison's ambulance was inoperable. So after Toro was charged with his second homicide, he again agreed to give a taped statement and reenacted the crime. So according to Toro's own admission, he claimed that he decided to take Mahoney out as soon as they were placed out there on the yard together. He said that he rocked Mahoney to sleep, or he made him feel at ease by telling him that he didn't want no problems. Furthermore, he said that as soon as he seen Mahoney, he knew that he was an easy mark. And then Toro went on to say that he was planning different ways to take Mahoney out, and that initially he planned to lunge at Mahoney and break his neck, but that he wasn't able to get the kind of grip on him that he wanted to. Then Toro said the reason why he drug him to the far corner of the yard was to make it harder for the gun tower to take a shot at him. He said, I drug him to the corner because I knew it would be harder for the gunner to hit me in the corner and that they wouldn't be able to stop me from taking his life. According to the investigator that interviewed Toro, he said that he got the impression that Toro was on some kind of mission and that he talked like he was trying to get some kind of payback. And then Toro actually confirmed it with the last part of his statement. Toro said that as he pulled the ligature tighter, that he could actually hear Mahoney gurgling in his own blood. Intent on hurting this guy as much as he could, he said he used his foot to repeatedly slam Mahoney's head into the wall. So after Mahoney met his demise, Toro then took some of his blood and wrote a happy face on the wall. So after Mahoney met his demise, Toro then took some of his blood and drew a happy face on the wall. Now this is the part right here that hurt Toro, and this is what dictated the outcome of his trial. Toro told the investigator, I did it. So what? What are you gonna do? There's nothing you can do to me. As to motive, he said, I snapped when they gave me life for that chicken shit ass case. I told myself, I made a deal with the devil. If you give me an opportunity, man, to pick up a murder for each one of those strikes, I'm gonna earn each and every one of those strikes. And then Toro confirmed to the investigator that if given the chance, he'd kill again by saying, I hope there's 10 or 15 more bodies. However many you want to give me. So Toro wrapped up the interview by saying that his whole objective from now until he dies is to kill, to hurt, to cause as much destruction as he could, wherever, whenever, and however he can. And then he said, oh, and as far as I'm concerned, I don't got a soul no more. I don't give a fuck no more. Nothing else matters to me. Those were his statements, and that was the extent of his interview. So after the death of Mahoney, the officer that was working in the gun tower that day, an officer by the name of Enrique Mexicano, was subsequently fired. The same prosecutor that prosecuted Toro actually recommended that that officer, amongst others, who he felt were complicit in Mahoney's death, should all face prosecution charges the same way the 8 officers in 1994 were implicated in the shooting death of Preston Tate. In the end, Officer Enrique Mexicano wasn't prosecuted. None of the officers were prosecuted. However, the state ultimately decided to settle out with Mahoney's family for $525,000. In closing, this story is more of a common theme in prison than people might think. Those that either get struck out or pick up a life sentence for a case that they don't feel they were culpable in end up feeling like they need to make that time worth it. If I got struck out for a bullshit case, or I got life for a case that I felt like I got railroaded in, I'd feel the same way. Toro ended up getting the death penalty, but it was his own statements that ended up hurting him. It wasn't just the fact that he expressed no remorse for what he did. It was also the fact that he made statements and talked about how he planned both of these murders. By his own admission, he claimed that he was lying in wait, waiting for the officer to come by and do his count before he strangled Joker. And then the same can be said about Mahoney. For the 52 minutes that he waited to launch his attack against Mahoney, he planned it and he waited for the opportunity. That's where the special circumstances came into play. Anyways, I know this is a short one, but I'm already working on more stories. So the next one will be coming out as soon as I finish putting the pictures in. I have that other story about Bat from San Diego, Richie from Otay, and Psycho from Paradise Hills about halfway done. So as soon as I get the rest of it from my source, which should be after Christmas, Thursday, I'll get that out too. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and those of you who continue to stand with me. As I've been saying, I might not get around to answering every one of the comments, but trust me, I read and see most of them and I make mental notes of what some of you guys are saying. Again, the negativity is insignificant. The haters and the faceless trolls are made to feel relevant only when they're made to feel relevant. And although some people might think people are laughing with them, because there's always going to be a few, most people are laughing at them. Remember that. It's all for views, people. It's all for views. Anyways, you guys enjoy your week and continue pushing that positivity. Again, Merry Christmas to everybody that counts. And for those of you that don't, I'm not even going to say it. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.